June 4, 1942. The waters off Midway Island turn crimson with the blood of empires. American dive bombers scream through flak-filled skies, sending Japanese carriers to the bottom of the Pacific. But amid the chaos of this pivotal battle, one aircraft vanishes beneath the waves carrying something the enemy didn't even know they'd lost. Something so valuable that when U.S. Navy divers finally recovered it decades later, military historians would call it the find that validated an entire strategy. What they pulled from that twisted wreckage wasn't just metal and machinery. It was the physical proof of one of the greatest intelligence coups in military history, a secret so closely guarded that even today some details remain classified. This is the story of how a sunken Japanese aircraft revealed the vulnerabilities that changed the course of the Pacific War and revolutionized naval warfare forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're fascinated by untold military history and want to discover more hidden moments that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's greatest secrets. And if you enjoy this video, leave a comment telling us what World War II mystery you'd like us to investigate next. Now, let's descend into the depths where history waited decades to tell its secrets. Chapter 1. The Battle That Shouldn't Have Been Won. The morning of June 4, 1942, should have marked the beginning of America's defeat in the Pacific. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy commanded the world's most powerful carrier strike force. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, approached Midway Atoll with a battle group that had terrorized the Pacific from Hawaii to Ceylon. Against them, the United States Navy fielded 3 carriers, one of them hastily repaired after being nearly sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. On paper, the odds heavily favored Japan. Their pilots were veterans of countless victories, their planes were battle-tested, and their admirals had never tasted defeat. But the Americans possessed something more valuable than numbers or experience. They possessed knowledge. For months, a team of cryptanalysts working in a basement at Pearl Harbor had been breaking Japanese naval codes. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, these unsung heroes had intercepted and decrypted enemy communications, revealing not just that an attack was coming, but where and when. The target, designated AF in Japanese messages, was confirmed through an ingenious trick. American commanders sent an uncoded message claiming Midway's water distillation plant had broken down. Days later, intercepted Japanese transmissions reported that AF was short on fresh water. The trap was set. The hunters had become the hunted. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, made a gutsy decision. Instead of waiting defensively at Pearl Harbor, he would ambush the ambushers. Task Force 16 and Task Force 17, centered around the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, took up positions northeast of Midway. The Japanese had no idea American carriers were anywhere near the target zone. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese strike force, expected to bomb Midway's installations, lure out whatever American forces responded, and destroy them at his leisure. He had done exactly this at Pearl Harbor with devastating effect. There was no reason to expect anything different now. The battle began at dawn with Japanese aircraft pounding Midway's defenses. American planes based on the atoll launched counterattacks that were slaughtered. Obsolete torpedo bombers fell from the sky like wounded birds, their crews never having a chance against the experienced Japanese fighter pilots. Of the 41 Devastator torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, only 6 survived. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet was completely annihilated, every single aircraft shot down with only 1 crew member surviving. It seemed the Japanese invincibility was holding, but these brave men had done something crucially important. They had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top level, leaving the sky above undefended. At 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 33 dive bombers from the Enterprise into that unguarded sky. They had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, nearly at the point where they'd have to turn back or ditch in the ocean when fuel ran out. Then McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northward. It was heading back to the fleet after depth-charging an American submarine. Following its wake like an arrow pointing to treasure, McCluskey found the Japanese carriers. They were at their most vulnerable moment. Aircraft were being refueled and rearmed on deck, fuel lines were open, ordnance was stacked everywhere. The ships were floating bombs waiting for a spark. McCluskey gave the order, and American dive bombers screamed down from 14,000 feet. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were transformed into floating infernos. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, took a bomb straight through its flight deck into the hangar where aircraft were being armed. The explosion set off a chain reaction of secondary blasts that gutted the ship. Kaga suffered 4 direct hits and numerous near misses, her wooden flight deck erupting in flames that couldn't be controlled. Soryu took 3 bombs that penetrated to her hangar deck, igniting aircraft and torpedoes in catastrophic explosions. By 10:30 a.m., the strategic balance of the Pacific War had shifted in 6 minutes of screaming dive bombers and exploding ordnance. But the battle wasn't over. Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier, had been operating separately and escaped the initial attack. Her aircraft launched a devastating counterstrike against the Yorktown, hitting her with bombs and torpedoes that left her dead in the water. It seemed the Japanese might yet snatch victory from disaster. Then, in the afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu. She joined her sister ships as a blazing wreck. By the next morning, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had sunk or were sinking. American had lost Yorktown and a destroyer, but Japan had lost the core of its carrier-striking power, ships that would take years to replace, and more importantly, veteran pilots and aircrew who were truly irreplaceable. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. Chapter 2. The Secret Beneath the Waves. As the Battle of Midway raged above the waves, below the surface a different kind of battle was being lost. Japanese aircraft shot down by American fighters and anti-aircraft fire tumbled into the deep, carrying with them pilots, crew members, and onboard equipment. Among the dozens of aircraft that splashed into the Pacific that day was a Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter, the legendary aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies since the war began. This particular Zero was different from the others. It carried equipment and code books that its pilot would have normally destroyed before ditching or crash landing. But this pilot never had that chance. Hit by anti-aircraft fire from American ships, the Zero had plummeted into the ocean so quickly that its pilot had no time to follow procedures. Within seconds, the aircraft sank into the darkness, its secrets intact. For the Americans fighting at Midway, this Zero was just one more enemy aircraft destroyed among dozens. No one could have known what it carried, and even if they had, recovering aircraft from the deep Pacific in 1942 was technologically impossible. The battle moved on. The war moved on. The Zero and its contents rested on the seafloor, 500 fathoms down in crushing darkness and pressure that would kill a human instantly. It seemed destined to remain there forever, slowly corroding in the salt water, its secrets dissolving into rust and decay. The immediate value of capturing its contents, cryptographic materials, operational documents, perhaps even code books, would have been immense in 1942. But by the time technology advanced enough to even consider deep-sea recovery, surely such materials would be worthless, their codes long since changed, their intelligence value reduced to historical curiosity. Except history has a way of vindicating the past. In the decades following World War II, a debate raged among military historians and strategists about the Battle of Midway and the broader question of intelligence in warfare. Some argued that the American victory had been primarily due to superior code breaking, that Rochefort's team had essentially won the battle before a single shot was fired. Others insisted that while intelligence helped, it was American courage, Japanese mistakes, and sheer luck that determined the outcome. Could reading enemy mail really be more important than fighting ability? Was Midway a fluke? Or was it proof that information dominance could overcome material disadvantage? These weren't just academic questions. They had profound implications for how the United States would structure its military in the Cold War era and beyond. The debate intensified through the 1960s and 1970s as the importance of signals intelligence in modern warfare became increasingly apparent. The National Security Agency, successor to the codebreakers who had worked at Pearl Harbor, grew into one of America's most important intelligence organizations. But skeptics remained. They pointed out that intelligence failures, Pearl Harbor itself, the Bay of Pigs, the Tet Offensive, seemed as common as intelligence successes. Maybe Midway had been an outlier, a perfect storm of good intel, good luck, and enemy errors that couldn't be replicated. What was needed was concrete, physical proof of exactly what the Americans had known before Midway, what the Japanese thought they were keeping secret, and how that information gap had determined the battle's outcome. That proof lay on the ocean floor, slowly corroding but not yet destroyed. The Zero that had crashed during the battle carried something that would become more valuable with time rather than less, not because its secrets remained viable, but because it could serve as a time capsule, preserving the exact state of Japanese security and American intelligence penetration at the war's turning point. If recovered and studied, it could settle historical debates and provide invaluable lessons for modern intelligence operations. But finding a single aircraft in an area where dozens had crashed, in water over 15,000 feet deep, in an ocean that covers 64 million square miles, seemed like an impossible task. It would require technology that didn't exist in 1942 and wouldn't exist for decades to come. By the mid-1990s, that technology had finally arrived. Deep-sea exploration capabilities, developed for oil prospecting, scientific research, and submarine rescue operations, could now reach depths that had been unreachable 50 years earlier. Remote-operated vehicles equipped with cameras and sonar could map the sea floor and investigate wrecks without risking human divers. The U.S. Navy, which had been conducting oceanographic research in the Pacific for years, began to consider whether it might be possible to locate and study wrecks from the Battle of Midway. The mission would be framed as historical research and recovery of fallen servicemen, but there was another motive: proving, once and for all, what role intelligence had played in America's most important naval victory. The search mission was classified, conducted under the cover of routine naval exercises and oceanographic surveys. Using sophisticated sonar and magnetic anomaly detection equipment, Navy vessels spent months mapping the seafloor in the area where the battle had occurred. They were looking for the distinctive signatures of downed aircraft, shapes too regular to be natural geology, metallic anomalies in areas that should be barren rock and sediment. It was like searching for needles in a haystack the size of a small state. But they had one advantage. They knew from historical records and pilot debriefings approximately where aircraft had gone down. Even with that knowledge, the search took years. The Pacific doesn't give up its secrets easily. Then, in 1998, they found it. A ROV descending into the eternal darkness, its lights cutting through the murk, its cameras transmitting grainy images back to the surface. There, resting on the seafloor as if it had landed yesterday, was a Mitsubishi Zero. Its paint was faded, its aluminum skin corroded by decades of salt water, but it was remarkably intact. Most importantly, its cockpit appeared to be sealed, meaning that whatever documents and equipment it contained might have been preserved in an anaerobic environment, protected from complete decay. The discovery sent excitement rippling through the Navy's historical and intelligence divisions. If they could recover this aircraft, if they could extract and analyze its contents, they might finally have the physical evidence they needed to understand exactly how the Battle of Midway had really been won. Chapter 3. The Recovery Operation. Recovering an aircraft from 15 Zorzeren feet below the ocean's surface is not like salvaging a car from a lake. The pressure at that depth is more than 450 times atmospheric pressure, enough to crush a human body instantly. Enough to implode unprotected equipment, enough to make every movement and every operation a carefully calculated exercise in deep-sea engineering. The Zero, sitting on the seafloor for over 50 years, had become part of its environment. Marine organisms had colonized it, sediment had partially buried it, and its structure, weakened by corrosion, might collapse if handled improperly. The Navy would need to mount one of the most sophisticated deep-sea recovery operations ever attempted, all while keeping the mission classified and avoiding any international complications. The first challenge was political and diplomatic. The waters off Midway, while in an area the United States controlled, were also a war grave containing the remains of Japanese and American servicemen. International law and basic human decency required that such sites be treated with respect. The Navy would need to ensure that their recovery operation didn't disturb other wrecks or remains, and that any human remains encountered would be handled with appropriate dignity. There was also the question of whether the recovery should be revealed to the Japanese government. Ultimately, the decision was made to keep the operation classified until after its completion, to avoid political complications that might jeopardize the mission. The technical challenges were even more daunting. Standard salvage techniques, sending down divers with cables, attaching flotation devices, lifting the object to the surface, were completely impossible at this depth. No human diver could survive there, and the Zero's corroded structure likely couldn't withstand the stress of being lifted through 15,000 feet of water column. Instead, the Navy assembled a specialized team and deployed some of the most advanced deep-sea technology in existence. The centerpiece of the operation was a heavy-duty, remote-operated vehicle, essentially a robot submarine equipped with manipulator arms, cutting tools, cameras, and a basket for recovering objects. This ROV would serve as the hands of the salvage team, controlled by operators on a surface vessel, but working in an environment that would kill a human in seconds. The operation began with a detailed photographic survey of the wreck. The ROV made multiple passes over the Zero, its high-definition cameras capturing every angle, every detail, every piece of the aircraft. Engineers on the surface studied these images intensely, creating a 3D model of the wreck and planning exactly how to approach the recovery. They couldn't simply grab the aircraft and lift it. Doing so would likely cause it to break apart. Instead, they would need to carefully extract specific components: the cockpit area where documents might be stored, the radio equipment bay where codebooks and encryption materials would have been kept, and any other areas that might contain intelligence material. It would be like performing surgery at a distance of 3 miles with robotic hands, in total darkness except for the ROV's lights. The actual recovery took weeks. The ROV would descend each day, a journey that itself took hours, locate the wreck, and begin the painstaking process of cutting through corroded metal and carefully extracting pieces of the aircraft. The manipulator arms, while sophisticated, lacked the fine control of human hands. Every movement had to be slow and deliberate. Engineers on the surface watched through the ROV's cameras, giving instructions to the pilot, holding their collective breath each time the robot arms grasped a piece of the 60-year-old aircraft. Some components came away easily, while others required careful cutting with hydraulic shears and diamond-tipped saws. Each recovered piece was placed in a basket attached to the ROV. And when the basket was full, it was detached and sent to the surface on its own, rising slowly through the water column to avoid damage from rapid pressure changes. As pieces of the Zero began arriving on the surface ship, the recovery team realized they had succeeded beyond their hopes. The cockpit section, though corroded and encrusted with marine growth, had remained relatively intact. More importantly, a sealed compartment behind the pilot's seat, designed to hold charts, documents, and emergency equipment, had maintained enough of its integrity that its contents had been partially preserved. The water that had eventually seeped in had been low in oxygen, creating a somewhat preserving environment. When the compartment was carefully opened aboard the ship, conservators found documents. They were waterlogged, faded, and fragile, but they were readable. And they were exactly what the intelligence analysts had hoped to find. The recovery operation concluded with one final sobering task. During the extraction of the cockpit section, the remains of the Zero's pilot were discovered, still strapped into his seat. Navy protocol required that enemy remains recovered, during such operations, be treated with the same respect accorded to American service members. The pilot's remains were carefully recovered, documented, and later turned over to Japanese authorities for proper burial. His identity was eventually established through dental records and unit insignia found with the aircraft. He had been 23 years old, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, one of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Navy. He had followed his orders, fought his battle, and died serving his country. Even enemies deserve honor in death, and the American recovery team ensured he received it. With the recovery complete and the most promising pieces of the Zero on their way to a naval laboratory, the surface ship departed the area. Behind them, the rest of the wreck remained on the sea floor, a memorial to those who had fought and died there. But the pieces they had recovered, carefully preserved, meticulously documented, and now ready for analysis, were about to reveal secrets that had been waiting 56 years to be told. What was in those documents? What codes and procedures and intelligence had the Zero carried? And what would it finally prove about the Battle of Midway and the role of intelligence in winning wars? The answers would exceed even the most optimistic predictions of the intelligence analysts waiting to examine the recovery. Chapter 4. What lay inside? The sealed containers carrying pieces of the recovered Zero arrived at a classified naval facility designed specifically for the analysis and preservation of historical military artifacts. This wasn't a museum or a public archive. It was a working intelligence laboratory where historians, cryptanalysts, and materials scientists could study recovered items without the constraints of public access or academic bureaucracy. The priority items, the documents and equipment from the sealed compartment, were immediately transferred to a specialized clean room where conservators began the delicate process of stabilizing and preparing them for examination. What they were about to discover would validate decades of intelligence work and prove, beyond any remaining doubt, just how completely American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval security. The first items examined were the code books. Every Japanese naval aircraft carried encoding materials that pilots were supposed to destroy if capture seemed imminent, throwing them overboard, burning them, or shredding them beyond recognition. The Zero pilot at Midway never had that chance. His aircraft had gone down too quickly, and the sealed compartment had protected his code books from complete destruction. They were waterlogged, and some pages were illegible, but enough remained to allow cryptanalysts to reconstruct the codes. What they found was remarkable. These were the exact codes that Commander Rochefort's team at Station Hypo had been breaking in the months before Midway. Seeing them in physical form, comparing them to the decrypted messages in American archives, the analysts could confirm with absolute certainty that the United States had been reading Japanese naval communications in near real time before the battle. But it went deeper than that. The codebooks also revealed something that American intelligence had suspected but never confirmed. The Japanese knew their codes might be compromised. Margin notes in the codebook, written in the pilot's hand, included reminders about additional security procedures that weren't in the official code itself. Extra layers of encryption, code words within code words, measures meant to complicate cryptanalysis. The fact that the Americans had broken through all of these layers, had cut through the security measures like they didn't exist, demonstrated a level of cryptanalytic capability that even Japanese commanders who suspected compromise couldn't have imagined. The Japanese had believed their codes were perhaps readable with immense effort over weeks or months. They never imagined the Americans were reading their mail daily, sometimes within hours of transmission. The second major discovery came from documents found in the cockpit, operational orders, mission briefings, and charts. These confirmed what historians had long believed but critics had disputed. The Japanese had no idea American carriers were near Midway. The mission orders for the Zero pilot mentioned the possibility of enemy land-based aircraft, but expressed no concern whatsoever about carriers. The charts showed planned flight routes that would have been suicidal if the pilot had known 3 American carriers were waiting northeast of Midway. Most tellingly, the mission briefing dated June 3, 1942, the day before the battle, referred to the American carrier fleet as being at least 4 days away from the target area. That intelligence failure alone explained why Nagumo's carriers had been caught so completely unprepared. They weren't expecting American carriers because Japanese naval intelligence had told them there were none nearby. The radio equipment recovered from the Zero provided a third category of revelations. Analysts disassembled the radios carefully because corrosion had made them fragile, and discovered that they were using frequencies and protocols that American listening stations had been monitoring throughout 1942. More significantly, the radio equipment included a frequency hopping mechanism meant to make Japanese transmissions harder to intercept and locate. But the hopping sequence, which should have been random, followed a mathematical pattern. American signals intelligence had identified this pattern and exploited it, allowing them to follow Japanese transmissions even as they hopped frequencies. The Japanese pilots had believed their communications were secure. In reality, American listening stations were capturing nearly everything they transmitted, providing not just intelligence on Japanese plans, but also tactical information on where Japanese aircraft were and what they were doing in real time during battles. Perhaps most revealing were personal items found with the pilot, a diary, letters from home, and a small notebook containing observations about American tactics and aircraft. The diary entries from early 1942 showed a pilot who was supremely confident in Japanese superiority, who believed the war would be over in months, who couldn't imagine the Americans mounting any serious resistance. But entries from May 1942, weeks before Midway, showed growing concerns. The pilot noted that American fighters seemed to know where Japanese aircraft were going to be, that American ships sometimes changed course just before Japanese aircraft arrived, that there seemed to be fewer surprises and more prepared defenses. He couldn't know that his observations were evidence of American code breaking. He simply noted, with growing unease, that the Americans seemed to be getting harder to surprise. The technical analysis of the aircraft itself provided the final piece of the puzzle. Engineers examining the Zero's navigation and communication systems found that they were sophisticated but not cryptographically secured. Japanese aircraft communicated in code, but the code was linguistic, substitution ciphers and code words, rather than cryptographic in the modern sense. There was no encryption device, no machine cipher, nothing like the German Enigma or the American Sagaba. The Japanese believed that their codes, being in their own language and using military terminology, would be unbreakable by Americans who had limited knowledge of Japanese. They never anticipated that American intelligence had recruited Japanese-American linguists, that these linguists would become expert cryptanalysts, and that the combination of linguistic knowledge and mathematical code breaking would render Japanese naval codes almost transparent. When the analysis team compiled their findings, the conclusion was inescapable. The Battle of Midway had been won by intelligence as much as by courage. The physical evidence from the Zero confirmed that American code breakers had achieved comprehensive penetration of Japanese naval communications, that the Japanese had no idea this penetration existed, and that this intelligence advantage had allowed the Americans to set up an ambush that turned the war's tide. Critics who had argued that Midway was primarily luck, or that intelligence played only a supporting role, were confronted with irrefutable proof. The Americans had known what was coming, when it was coming, and where it was coming. They had known Japanese capabilities, Japanese plans, and Japanese assumptions. In any conflict, such complete intelligence dominance is almost impossible to overcome. The Japanese never had a chance, and the evidence from the Zero proved it. Chapter 5. The Intelligence War. The recovery and analysis of the Zero wreckage provided a unique window into an aspect of World War II that remained shrouded in secrecy for decades after the war ended: the intelligence battle between the United States and Japan. While the shooting war in the Pacific has been extensively documented, the battles, the campaigns, the strategic decisions, the invisible war of code-breaking, signals intelligence, and information security has been less well understood by the public. The Zero's contents allowed intelligence historians to piece together exactly how the Americans achieved their stunning intelligence victory, and equally importantly, why the Japanese never realized they had been compromised until it was too late to matter. The story begins not at Midway, but in the months following Pearl Harbor, when American cryptanalysts were desperately trying to rebuild intelligence capabilities that had been caught flat-footed by the Japanese attack. Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's signals intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, was led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant and eccentric officer who combined mathematical genius with an intuitive understanding of how Japanese naval officers thought. Rochefort assembled a team that included some of the finest mathematical minds in America, Japanese-American linguists whose loyalty to the United States was unquestioned despite the shameful internment of their families, and communications experts who understood the technical side of radio interception. This team worked 18-hour days in a basement bunker, listening to Japanese radio transmissions, breaking codes, and gradually building a picture of enemy intentions. The Japanese codes that Rochefort's team faced were not simple substitution ciphers. The Imperial Japanese Navy used a complex system called JN-25, which combined codebooks with mathematical encipherment. A message would first be encoded using 5-digit code groups from the codebook, each group representing a word, phrase, or concept. Then these code groups would be enciphered by adding them to 5-digit numbers from additive tables, creating the final encrypted message. Breaking this system required obtaining the codebooks, recovering the additive tables, and doing both faster than the Japanese could change their codes. It was a mathematical and logistical challenge that seemed nearly impossible. Yet Rochefort's team, working with cryptanalysts in Washington and in Australia, managed to achieve regular breaks into JN-25 by spring of 1942. The documents recovered from the Zero confirmed the specific version of JN-25 that had been in use during the Midway period, allowing modern cryptanalysts to verify that American code breakers had indeed achieved the level of penetration claimed in wartime reports. But the recovered materials also revealed something that had been suspected but never proven. The Japanese had made critical security errors that made the American codebreakers' job easier. One error was using certain code groups too frequently. When the same 5-digit group appeared repeatedly in different messages, cryptanalysts could use frequency analysis to guess what it might mean, probably a common word like carrier or attack or a geographical reference. Another error was the tendency of Japanese radio operators to use stereotyped message openings and closings, giving cryptanalysts known plaintext to work with. These errors weren't dramatic failures. They were small procedural lapses that individually meant little but cumulatively created vulnerabilities that skilled cryptanalysts could exploit. The Zero's materials also revealed how Japanese naval aviators used their codes in practice, and these practical usage patterns created additional vulnerabilities. For example, the mission orders carried by the pilot included both coded and uncoded information. The uncoded portions, timing, weather conditions, aircraft assignments, weren't considered sensitive enough to encode. But by comparing the uncoded information with the coded portions, American cryptanalysts could make educated guesses about what the codes meant. If an uncoded reference to 4 carriers appeared near an encoded group that kept showing up in different messages, chances were excellent that encoded group meant carrier division or something similar. The Japanese never realized that mixing encoded and uncoded information in the same documents was creating a Rosetta Stone that helped their enemies break their codes. Perhaps the most significant revelation from the recovered documents was evidence of Japanese complacency about code security. American cryptanalysts had wondered whether the Japanese suspected compromise, whether the string of American intelligence successes might have triggered a security review. The answer was in the margins of the codebook. Annotations showed that as late as June 1942, Japanese officers believed their codes were secure. There were notes about security procedures, but they were routine reminders, not evidence of heightened concern. Even more remarkably, there was no indication that the Japanese connected American tactical successes with potential code compromise. When American forces showed up in unexpected places, or seemed to anticipate Japanese moves, Japanese commanders attributed it to spy networks, to radio direction finding, to luck, to anything except the reality that their supposedly unbreakable codes had been broken. This Japanese failure to realize their communications were compromised had strategic implications that extended far beyond Midway. Because they didn't know their codes were broken, the Japanese continued using the same systems, with only routine changes, throughout 1942 and into 1943. American cryptanalysts got better and faster at breaking each new variant of JN-25. What started as partial, delayed reading of Japanese messages became near real-time intelligence on Japanese naval operations. By 1943, American commanders in the Pacific had such complete knowledge of Japanese movements that they could avoid enemy strength and strike at weakness with uncanny precision. Submarines ambushed Japanese convoys because they knew the convoy routes. Aircraft attacked Japanese bases because they knew when those bases would be lightly defended. American carriers maneuvered to avoid Japanese search patterns because they knew where those searches would occur. The intelligence advantage gained at Midway never dissipated. It only grew stronger. The recovery of the Zero allowed intelligence historians to quantify this advantage with unprecedented precision. By comparing the codes and documents from the aircraft with the decrypted messages in American archives, analysts could determine that by the time of Midway, the United States was successfully reading approximately 70% of Japanese naval communications within 24 hours of transmission. By late 1942, that figure had risen to over 80%, with many high-priority messages being read within hours. No military force in history had ever achieved such comprehensive penetration of an enemy's command and control systems. The Japanese were effectively fighting blind against an enemy who could see their every move. That they held out as long as they did is testament to Japanese courage and tactical skill, But no amount of courage could overcome such a fundamental information disadvantage. The war in the Pacific was decided not just by aircraft carriers and Marines, but by mathematicians and linguists working in basement offices, breaking codes, and reading the enemy's mail. Chapter 6. The Lessons Learned. When the analysis of the recovered Zero was finally declassified in 2001, it sparked a revolution in how military strategists thought about intelligence and information warfare. The physical evidence from Midway, combined with now accessible archives from both American and Japanese sources, provided an unprecedented case study in how information dominance could determine the outcome of conflicts. War colleges around the world began incorporating the Midway intelligence operation into their curricula, not as a historical curiosity, but as a template for modern information warfare. The lessons learned from a 60-year-old aircraft recovery would shape military doctrine for the 21st century. The first and most obvious lesson was the overwhelming importance of signals intelligence in modern warfare. Before the Midway evidence became public, there had been ongoing debates within military establishments about the relative value of different intelligence sources. Human intelligence, spies and agents, had traditionally been considered the gold standard. Aerial reconnaissance and satellite imagery had become increasingly important in the Cold War era. But signals intelligence, the interception and analysis of enemy communications, was sometimes dismissed as supporting rather than decisive. The Midway case proved definitively that signals intelligence, when properly exploited, could be war-winning. The United States hadn't needed spies in Tokyo or reconnaissance photos of Japanese carrier positions. They simply needed to read Japanese radio messages, and that intelligence alone had been sufficient to turn the tide of the Pacific War. The second lesson was about operational security and the catastrophic consequences of its failure. The Japanese had believed their codes were secure because they were complex and because they were in Japanese, a language few Americans knew. This complacency had cost them the war's turning point and arguably the war itself. Modern military planners studying the case recognized analogies to contemporary cybersecurity. Organizations often believe their systems are secure because they're complex, or because they use proprietary technologies, or because they assume adversaries lack certain capabilities. The Japanese assumption that Americans couldn't break Japanese codes paralleled the modern assumption that adversaries can't break modern encryption or penetrate secure networks. Midway taught that such assumptions are dangerous. Any code can be broken given enough time and talent. Any system can be penetrated. Operational security requires assuming compromise and implementing layers of protection, not assuming invulnerability. The third lesson concerned the indicator problem in intelligence analysis. The recovered documents from the Zero showed that Japanese commanders had noticed anomalies, American forces appearing in unexpected places, defenses being prepared, convoys being rerouted, but had failed to connect these indicators to the possibility of code compromise. Modern intelligence training now emphasizes looking for patterns of compromise. If the enemy consistently seems to know where you are or what you're planning, if operations repeatedly fail because the enemy was prepared, if losses exceed what chance would predict, these are indicators of intelligence compromise. The Japanese noticed all these signs, but failed to reach the correct conclusion. Teaching analysts to recognize and act on such patterns became a key component of intelligence education after the Midway case study became available. The fourth lesson was about the operational impact of intelligence advantage. The Zero recovery allowed military historians to quantify exactly how much of a difference comprehensive intelligence made to combat outcomes. By comparing battles where Americans had good intelligence versus battles where they didn't, researchers found that intelligence advantage multiplied combat effectiveness by a factor of 3 to 5. Put simply, 3 American ships with good intelligence could fight 5 Japanese ships on roughly even terms. 3 American aircraft with knowledge of enemy positions were worth 5 aircraft attacking blindly. This multiplier effect explained how the United States, starting from a position of material and numerical disadvantage in 1942, had achieved naval superiority by 1943. Intelligence hadn't just helped at Midway, it had helped everywhere, every day, in every engagement. The cumulative effect of that advantage had been overwhelming. The fifth lesson was perhaps the most important for the modern era. The fragility of secure communications in the face of determined adversaries. The Japanese codes were not weak by the standards of their era. JN-25 was as sophisticated as anything except the most advanced machine ciphers. Yet it had been broken, systematically and comprehensively, by a relatively small team of cryptanalysts. The lesson for the modern era was sobering. Contemporary communications encryption, including systems considered highly secure, might be vulnerable to adversaries with sufficient resources and determination. The National Security Agency, the CIA, and military intelligence services around the world drew the conclusion that communication security couldn't be taken for granted. Even advanced encryption needed to be regularly updated, usage patterns needed to be varied to prevent traffic analysis, and alternative communication methods needed to be available if primary systems were compromised. The sixth lesson addressed what modern military terminology calls the decision cycle. American forces at Midway had achieved what would later be called getting inside the enemy's decision cycle. They knew what the Japanese were going to do before Japanese commanders had finished planning it. This meant American forces could position themselves optimally, prepare appropriate responses, and execute their attacks before the Japanese could react. The intelligence from the Zero confirmed that this hadn't been luck or coincidence. The Americans had systematically observed Japanese planning, understood Japanese intentions, and acted on that knowledge faster than the Japanese could adapt. Modern military doctrine, influenced by this case study, now emphasizes the importance of information speed. The side that can collect information, analyze it, make decisions, and act on those decisions fastest will dominate the battlefield regardless of material advantages the enemy might possess. The seventh and final lesson was about the enduring value of intelligence archives and the importance of preserving capability even when immediate tactical value seems to have passed. The Zero and its contents had rested on the ocean floor for over 50 years before recovery. The codes it carried were obsolete decades before it was found. Yet the intelligence value of the recovery was immense. Not because the codes could still be exploited, but because they provided proof of concept, validated historical analysis, and offered lessons for future operations. Modern intelligence services studying this case reinforced their commitment to preserving intelligence materials, maintaining historical archives, and conducting after-action analysis, even of operations long past. The lessons learned from breaking JN-25 informed approaches to breaking Soviet codes during the Cold War, which in turn informed approaches to modern cryptanalysis. Intelligence work builds on itself across generations, and preserving the historical record ensures that lessons learned are never forgotten. These 7 lessons transformed how modern militaries approached information warfare. The Midway case study became required reading at the Naval War College, the Air Force's Air University, the Army's Command and General Staff College, and equivalent institutions in allied nations. CIA analysts studied it to understand the strategic impact of signals intelligence. NSA crypt analysts studied it to learn from the successes and failures of their predecessors. Even civilian cybersecurity professionals found value in the case, drawing parallels between code breaking in World War II and penetrating modern computer networks. A Japanese aircraft recovered from the Pacific Ocean in 1998 had become a teaching tool for 21st century information warriors, proof that the past never really dies. It just waits to teach its lessons to those willing to learn. Chapter 7. The Lasting Impact. The recovery of the Zero wreckage and the subsequent analysis of its contents didn't just settle historical debates or provide lessons for military doctrine. It fundamentally changed how nations approach the intersection of technology, intelligence, and warfare. The physical evidence from that single aircraft, combined with the now accessible archives from both sides of the Pacific War, created a body of knowledge that influenced everything from encryption standards to naval strategy to the structure of intelligence agencies. The ripples from that recovery operation continue to spread through military and intelligence communities worldwide, shaping decisions and strategies in conflicts the World War II combatants could never have imagined. Perhaps the most immediate impact was on cryptographic security standards. When the full extent of American code-breaking success at Midway became public knowledge, cryptographers around the world conducted urgent reviews of their own communications security. The realization that a major world power's military codes had been comprehensively broken, and that this compromise had gone undetected for years sent shockwaves through security establishments. Modern encryption standards, the algorithms that protect everything from military communications to banking transactions to personal emails, were strengthened based partly on lessons learned from JN-25's failure. The principle emerged that encryption security should never rely on the assumption that adversaries lack capability or that the cipher is too complex to break. Instead, encryption should remain secure even if the adversary knows exactly how the system works, protecting only the key itself. The impact on naval warfare doctrine was equally profound. The Midway case study validated a revolution that had been underway in naval thinking, the transformation from gun-based ship-to-ship combat to information-centric networked warfare. Modern naval battles are won not by the side with bigger guns or thicker armor, but by the side with better information about where enemy forces are, what they're doing, and what they're planning. The aircraft carrier, which replaced the battleship as the capital ship of naval warfare, was itself being supplemented by information systems, satellites, long-range sensors, networked communications, and data fusion centers that could create a comprehensive picture of the battle space. The Midway intelligence operation was the historical precedent that justified this transformation. If knowing the enemy's plans could allow 3 carriers to defeat 4, then modern information dominance could allow smaller forces to prevail against larger ones. The Zero recovery also influenced how the United States structured its intelligence community in the post-Cold War era. The National Security Agency, which had grown out of the Navy and Army cryptologic organizations that broke Japanese codes, used Midway as a case study to justify its budget and mission. When congressional oversight committees questioned the value of signals intelligence in an era of human rights concerns about surveillance, NSA officials could point to Midway and say, "This is what signals intelligence can achieve. This is why it matters." The case helped NSA weather budget cuts and mission challenges in the 1990s and early 2000s. It also influenced how intelligence agencies were reformed after September 11, 2001, with greater emphasis on breaking terrorist communications and understanding adversary intentions through signals intelligence. The recovery operation itself became a template for future underwater archaeological and intelligence missions. The techniques developed to find, document, and recover the Zero were refined and applied to other deep-sea recoveries. In 1999, the U.S. Navy used similar methods to locate and study the wreck of the Japanese submarine I-52, which had been carrying German military technology to Japan when it was sunk in 1944. In 2002, deep-sea recovery techniques were used to investigate the wreck of a Soviet submarine, recovering cryptographic equipment that provided insights into Cold War communication security. The oceanographic technology, the recovery procedures, and the analysis protocols developed for the Midway Zero recovery became standard practice for deep-sea intelligence operations, opening up a new dimension of historical and current intelligence gathering. On a more philosophical level, the Midway case study influenced how military strategists thought about the nature of warfare itself. Classical military theory, from Sun Tzu to Clausewitz to Mahan, had emphasized material factors: the number of soldiers, the quality of weapons, the strength of defenses, the skill of commanders. Information was always recognized as important, but it was considered a supporting factor rather than a decisive one. Midway proved that information could be the decisive factor, that knowing what the enemy would do could matter more than how many ships you had or how skilled your pilots were. This realization accelerated a transformation in military thinking that would culminate in concepts like network-centric warfare and information dominance. Modern military doctrine now treats information as the primary strategic resource, with material forces being the means of exploiting information advantage rather than the source of advantage itself. The cultural impact of the Zero recovery extended beyond military and intelligence circles. When the story was finally declassified and made public in the early 2000s, it captured public imagination in a way few historical discoveries do. Here was a tangible connection to one of World War II's most famous battles, a time capsule from 1942 that had been opened in 1998, revealing secrets that changed our understanding of how the war was won. Documentary films were made about the recovery. Books were written analyzing the intelligence implications. Museum exhibits featured artifacts from the Zero alongside code-breaking equipment from Station Hypo. helping the public understand that World War II had been won not just on battlefields, but in basement offices where mathematicians broke codes. The story resonated because it was both deeply historical and surprisingly modern, a tale of technology, intelligence, and information warfare that felt relevant to contemporary concerns about cybersecurity and electronic surveillance. For the families of those who fought at Midway, both American and Japanese, the recovery had personal significance. The identification and return of the Zero pilots' remains to Japan for proper burial brought closure to a family that had spent 56 years not knowing exactly where or how their loved one had died. American veterans of the battle, many in their late 70s and 80s when the recovery was made public, finally had physical confirmation that their victory had been as significant as they remembered. The recovery validated their sacrifice, and the sacrifice of those who didn't come home. It proved that Midway had indeed been the turning point of the Pacific War, that the young men who had flown through flak and flame that June day in 1942 had changed history. For those veterans, the Zero recovery was vindication, proof that their battle had mattered, that it had been studied and remembered, that future generations would learn from what they had done. The final impact of the Zero recovery is still unfolding. The aircraft components, documents, and equipment recovered from the Pacific are now preserved in climate-controlled archives where researchers continue to study them using ever more sophisticated techniques. Modern analysis methods, spectroscopy, digital enhancement, materials science, are revealing details that initial examinations missed. Each new analysis adds another piece to our understanding of the battle, the intelligence operation, and the technology of 1942. In this sense, the Zero is still giving up its secrets, still teaching lessons, still influencing how we think about warfare and intelligence. A single aircraft, shot down in 5 minutes of furious combat, has become one of the most studied artifacts in military history. Its recovery from the deep Pacific was more than a salvage operation. It was an act of historical resurrection that brought the past back to inform the future, proving that some secrets are worth waiting decades to discover, and that understanding history is essential to navigating the future. The conclusion. The story of the Zero recovery is ultimately a story about the power of information. In June 1942, American codebreakers' ability to read Japanese naval communications turned a battle that should have been a Japanese victory into an American triumph that changed the course of the Pacific War. 56 years later, the recovery of physical evidence from that battle validated the codebreakers' achievement and provided lessons that continue to shape military and intelligence operations in the 21st century. From the depths of the Pacific Ocean to the heights of modern strategic thinking, one aircraft's secrets have illuminated the past and informed the future. The divers who recovered that wreck didn't just bring up corroded metal and faded documents. They recovered proof that in warfare, as in life, knowledge is power. And those who possess superior knowledge will ultimately prevail, regardless of material disadvantage. That lesson, learned in blood at Midway and confirmed by evidence from the deep, remains as relevant today as it was 8 decades ago, when a young Japanese pilot climbed into his Zero for the last time, carrying secrets he would never know had already been revealed to his enemies.